it's never fun to not make it into a thing, even if it's just like a
yeah, like and pulling the trigger when I was like had my little draft email there, of like,
oh, those are always terrifying.
Sorry, bud. And so I hit like the continue button. So that's what happens instead of a set. It's like continue, and it's like, hey, this is gonna go to 805 people. Are you sure you want to do that? Whatever.
And you're like, I'm sorry.
I know exactly.
Butterscotch Shenanigans. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 506 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I do miscellaneous things.
I'm Sam and I'm a man in a sweater.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's February 7th, 2025. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep this podcast going. All right, so we got a lot of studio news this week. Now, a lot of things are happening in the world, but we're not going to talk about any of them because, frankly, everybody's talking about them.
Yep.
And you deserve a break.
Yeah.
As do we all. Spa day for your ears. So we're just going to talk about what's going on with Crashlands 2, what we're working on in the studio, and then if time permits, we'll get into half a question. So
as is custom.
So first off, that we are prepping for the beta of Crashlands 2, which our aim is it's like a week and a half basically from when we're recording this episode, and it's coming down to the wire. Just in sense of like
meaning we have a week and a half left to finish the game so that it can be beta tested.
Yeah. So the game is playable all the way to the end in the sense like all the quests are there, everything is there, but there's a lot of like dialogue polish that we're working on. There's visual polish. Sam's like animating some bosses, and it's like you can fight the bosses right now, but they're
you can't always tell what they're going to do next because they're just sitting there,
Yeah. Which isn't to say that none of them are animated, but just, this is very different than how things used to work because what you've talked about in the past of like, it used to be that Sam would basically stop doing art 6 months before launch and then pivot over to marketing, right? But because we've changed so many things about our development pipeline that now actually like Sam's going to be working on art probably right up until 2 minutes to launch, just because he can, and we've oriented things that way. And it's the Jevons paradox, right? Where like once you kind of like make something more efficient, then the demand for that thing goes up, right? Yeah. And so now we're just putting more art in the game.
Yep. But we're close. I say like we just have as far as like major assets, it really is just these remaining boss fights that are left. And
it's like and then the very end of the game, like the ending sequence, like how we're kind of conveying that.
Yeah. So and all that stuff is like one of the bosses is wrapped up, the ending sequence is wrapped up, and so there's just one boss remaining basically after this week. They take about a week, so I'll be sliding that bad boy in like day before. You know what I mean? Day before.
I think that's gonna be true of all the remaining quest stuff too, right? Because like the dialogue, like the quests are all roughed in, but the last chunk is only roughed in. So like I think Jen also said like it's gonna be like down to the wire, just getting everything fully polished up all the way to the end, right basically when the beta starts.
Yeah, we talk a lot about like what the point of the beta is, right? And one of the things we went back and forth on is one is just timing, which is that we know we have more than enough time to finish everything before the game launches. It's not necessarily the case we have time to finish everything before the beta happens, right? And that's like a funny place to be in.
Because that's 8 weeks before launch or whatever.
Exactly. So you always have this problem like with game production where because of timelines, what press need, what anybody else needs, especially if you're doing localization. It's not like all the text won't be localized that we get in there, right? So we're doing like an English only or English focused beta basically. And so a big part of what we talked about was like, okay, we need to do the beta at this moment in time because that gives us enough time to react to all the beta feedback. So part of the plan was also figuring out like, okay, if we can't get all of the art done, like where's the line, the cutoff line where you're like, okay, there's enough of it, people can deal. But I think we're going to be over that line, which is nice. That was something I was worried about on my side, but it seems like we'll have basically the whole thing done for that, and then hopefully it'll be polishing and feedback stuff for the next while. until we start handing out keys to influencers and do all the launch stuff. So
yeah, I mean the biggest thing is what I would probably have to describe as like experiential balance. Because like the game is really long, takes a long time to play through. Mm-hmm. And whether something feels good, so we're talking like a quest that you get at a certain time, or researching a new recipe that has some components in it, right? Like on paper, we can look at what's available to the player at that time and be like, okay, here are the components that make sense to put into this recipe at this point in time. Blah, blah, blah. But when you actually play through it, there's so many other things going on and that you're thinking about, or that you may have done in a different order or whatever, that when you actually experience that in a real playthrough, it might hit differently than what we thought it would. Mm-hmm. Right. And so one of the big reasons to do the beta then is to see how well things are matching up with what our expectations are in terms of like whether things are being delivered at a good pace, whether like certain weapons or items feel good to use at the time that you get them, and also, throughout the game and stuff like that.
We really should be. I mean, I think from the playthroughs we've done internally so far, we're at the point where it's just tweaking of stuff. It's not.
Yeah, it's playing with numbers and.
Yeah, or like moving this thing a little earlier, move that thing a little later. And I think that the thing that's most useful about a beta is the comparative feedback, because the reality is in a game like this where any given player might wander off and do things, like you said, in a slightly different order, have a different focus. It's really easy on the dev side to, if you have like a really limited pool, it's already happened, just internally, to end up balancing the game just sort of like around a viewpoint, a certain player, right? Even though, like the total experiential thing, like you can't quite account for all of it, which is part of the reason why the complexity of a game like this works, is because people can kind of choose their path through. So if you hit some weird, roadblock, you kind of work around it some other way while continuing to play. And so the nice thing about a beta is the comparative notes. So we'll have, we basically ask our beta testers to do these little, almost like a game log, like a game journal of their experience, so we can see how things are working, again, not just on like one person, but across a suite of people, because we've gotten enough of those like one person said things now at this point, from our own internal playthroughs and that sort of stuff. And so it's really time to be asking, what does the crowd say about this?
Well, there's that, and there's also this idea of like the golden path, where the game is, I wouldn't say it's like meant to be played in a certain way, but it's like best played in a certain way, right? Where like the way that the story flows and the way the zones are set up, if you travel through it and play through it in the way that's kind of like closest to what we envisioned, then that's going to probably be like the most well tested and well balanced and well thought out path for you to take. And every now and then people will do stuff, which we found out, for example, like when we did the closed alpha like a year ago, or a year and a half ago, that there are a few people who did some stuff that was so far outside of what our expectation was that we never expected that somebody would do that, because it didn't make sense for us to do that. I think for me, the funniest was the person who basically skipped almost everything and just went to the boss at the end of the first zone as fast as possible. So they basically ignored the story, ignored the quests, ignored the crafting, ignored pets, didn't have a good weapon, didn't have good armor, didn't have any equipment really. And they went and fought that boss,
which is impressive, because like there's story gates and stuff happening. It's like they
somehow found this
to get through.
But they should have make it in the boss room.
They were able to identify kind of like that path, and how to get there like in the shortest distance possible. But then, of course, they had some complaints about like this boss is really hard and takes forever to kill, right? And we're like, well, I mean, yes.
We're talking about context. Context is always key.
Yeah,
right?
And so then when stuff like that happens, it opens up questions for us of like,
do we allow for that?
If that's just a bad experience, or even like if somebody's potentially even likely to accidentally take that path, then should we add a few more gates in there to kind of make the player engage with a few more things before they get to that point. Or if it's just like a very unlikely thing to happen and the person has to go out of their way to do it, then we can just leave that path open for people who, for some reason, want to try to do that, right? So there's always kind of that push-pull between, in a game like this that's a bit more exploration-based and a bit more kind of like, there's lots of parallel paths you can take.
Well, and it's also because that concept, because you kind of, we stopped at that first boss fight and with this question as you're describing, right? Of like, if you get to this first boss fight and basically skipped as much of the content as you could, like, should we still allow that to be possible? Right. And if you stop at that first boss fight, the answer could probably just be like, yeah, just let them go for it, right? But then the question is, well, there's still 2/3 of the game left. Yeah. So if the player beats the boss in that state, have we accounted for that? Right? Have we accounted for them them not having done almost anything else in the rest of the game? And then if we haven't, then is
just
that
how
fun?
weird does this get?
Yeah, how weird does
well,
things get?
Because it also means that like the creatures that they come across at the start of the next zone are going to be level 5 creatures, and they're still going to be using a level 1 dagger, which means it's going to take them 5 times longer to kill everything, even the weakest things in the next zone, which is not really the experience that's intended at that point.
It's not where it's an open world thing, but it's not that open. You know what I mean? We're not trying to do that.
It is an RPG.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an RPG.
So things do scale like that. And so that means that if somebody does decide to try to like speed through and never craft stuff, then the game will just get progressively more boring and frustrating and worse for them over time because they keep pushing further and further into content that they have no business being in based on their power level. And it will just suck, right? So there's always kind of that, like when we do a beta or an alpha, we can kind of watch and see where people go, what they do, whether our sort of like breadcrumbs and stuff are actually leading them down the right paths, like down good paths, or whether we've accidentally, led people astray and fucked things up in some way.
It's always super interesting. And Adam, you did the selection for this, which is like, I mean, how many people we have? Like almost 1,000?
We had 900 people apply, which was pretty dope. It's easily the most applicants we've had for any test we've ever done, including the alpha, which we had at the alpha. I think we had like 150 applicants or something like that. But that was in the earlier days. We didn't have because this time we put announcements up on Steam and kind of like everywhere, right? And actually, probably like I don't know, something like a third or a half of everybody who applied came from Steam announcements this time around, right? So we got to kind of like leverage the fact that we built up this huge wish list group and people are subscribed to hear what happens on Steam. And we announced it on the original Crashlands page, which is actually, I think, most of where the Steam users came from because that's where most of our users are, So we got some good, we just got really good numbers this time around. However, the only people we can really reach who would give a shit are people who played original Crashlands. There were a handful, literally, I think 10 people in the list because we asked a question about like, have you played the original Crashlands? Did you play the Crashlands 2 demo? That kind of stuff. I think there were like 3 people who had done none of them, and there were like 10 people who had not played the original Crashlands, but almost all those had played the demo of Crashlands 2. Gotcha. So there's maybe like a couple of people then who are going to go to the playtest who like are unfamiliar with Crashlands as a franchise. And I was like, I want fucking somebody at least. I want to be able to hear from somebody who hasn't played any Crashlands before. So we'll see. One of them is in Discord and said something. So I was like, okay, thankfully they're at least going to communicate. So that's good.
It's a funny thing when you talk about like playtesting and stuff because you have this audience problem as always, which is who's listening to you to be able to even opt in. And it's always a struggle for devs. That's very
you gotta know who you're talking to. So if you put a list like this together, now we're gonna run this beta test with. So I had to pare that down to 100 people. So that was a laborious process trying to figure out how to do that. But now we have 100 people, and we need to have a sense of like when they start giving us feedback, we can't just say, oh, okay, here's a nice random selection of like who our future players could be, right? Because that's not who this is. This is people who are willing to do a beta test, right?
Play a worse version of the game.
Because they want earlier access or because they want to provide feedback or both, right?
They're just excited to be part of, the
so like some combination of that. So that's a very specific that's a gamer, right? A person who loves games, right? Yep. And the only reason they even knew to do this is because they know about original.
They're somehow following it already. Yeah, so you got selection bias is fucking intense.
It's an extreme kind of bias, which means that we have to be really careful how we interpret feedback. Where So especially things like if almost nobody is confused about something about like the lore of the game, well, that makes sense because they're all playing Crashlands. But if the people who if the one person who hasn't played Crashlands before is like, I don't understand what's happening here, we actually have to listen to that one person, and usually you don't listen to the one person, right? And so part of the idea with the survey or the application I had people do was to give us the kinds of information we thought we would need.
Again,
so
context.
That when to get enough context that when we're seeing their feedback, we can be like, okay, what's the deal with this person? You know, like have they played the original? Are they into games like this? You know, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of us trying to get a good sort of balanced selection of people at different sort of levels of passion about the Crashlands franchise, different amounts of playing it, whether or not they've played the original demo, because the other thing with that too is that the demo was out a year ago, or I guess 9 months ago, or something like that.
Close enough.
And it represents a pretty different experience than we currently have because enough has changed, especially balance-wise. Enough has changed in the game.
Well, and the demo was just meant to give you a peek into what is possible, right? So you would get like 1 or 2 items from an equipment set, and you'd be like, "Oh, okay, there are equipment sets."
You don't get the hatchet. You don't get
a pet.
No pets, no boss fights. No fishing.
But people who play the demo then are going to already have some idea of kind of like what the game is, and they won't be able to not compare their current experience to that one, right? Similar to people who were in the alpha test over a year ago, they're going to have some memory of what that game was like. And we work on the mobile controls all week, and we have that experience with our own team where we're each trying to test the mobile controls. But having been playing with the past mobile controls, right, and us being able to answer that question of like, is this better?
Mental jam, from like, I thought the button was here, but we moved it, and now I'm confused.
And so now when you're trying to
take that out while you're giving feedback, yeah,
exactly. So but players aren't used to doing that, right? And so we have to be really careful about how we interpret all this feedback. And part of the idea of the selection is to get a wide array of it, try to bias out some of these at least to some extent, and then otherwise kind of know what we're getting into once we get the feedback.
I will say one of my favorite things actually that always comes out of these tests is catching what I would call dumb technical problems that on launch are like the biggest bummers. So even in the alpha, there's this thing where the default GPU that the game would use on like a laptop was whatever the shitty onboard, not the actual like, powerful video card, but the like one built into the fucking motherboard.
So even if you had a great gaming laptop, you'd boot up Crashlands 2 and it would run at like 20 FPS.
Yeah, and it's stuff like, the opening cutscene was desynced. Like the audio
was desynced.
Stuff like that where like if you launch the game and then we hadn't seen that. We've been testing the shit out of this thing, right? But like just happen to not see it because of our devices. If you launch a game and that happens to even like 10% of people, man, it's a huge bummer on the dev side. Because again, you're just like, I don't want those to be the problems that we have.
Yeah, I want if people have a bad time, I want it to be because the game sucked and I made bad decisions.
100%. Not because the defaults are the wrong GPU. That's so boring. So dumb,
Give me interesting problems that people hate.
Yeah, and also people don't know that that's why the gameplay experience sucks. Right?
100%.
You get the blame on stuff that really wasn't on you.
Well, and it makes because the thing is like for that person, that's 100% of their experience with the game is the opening cutscene didn't fucking work, right? So everything they've experienced is that, and nobody from the dev team experienced it, right? So in their mind, they're like, what's the fuck is wrong with this dev team? Like, didn't they just boot up the game and see that this is broken?
Yep.
When really it's a hardware configuration problem that we didn't know about because none of us had that hardware combination.
So and the other thing we did with the selection, I mean, it ends up being like it's semi-randomized, right? Because what we're looking for is not just like a little bit of these selection biases of our own where we're trying to get some kind of mix, but also just like being able to test cross-platform stuff. So
the thing that I biased the most for was people having multiple devices that they were going to test on.
Yeah,
because that sort of solves two things at once. As Sam, as you're saying, like we need to have a good sense of device compatibility, minimum specs. Surprises that we actually can fix, that kind of stuff.
Technical dumb things. This is
technical
a great way
dumb
to beat
things.
this out, right?
And so if we have 100 people, but they represent 200 devices, Well, that's a very efficient way to test a whole bunch of different devices, right? So we get that, just a whole bunch of device coverage. Also, I bias towards people who are going to test with controllers because that's historically been under tested in all of our development. So get that also, and then we get to test all the Rumpus stuff. So like, does the login make sense? Does it work as expected? Can people bounce around between devices and get their saves? And are they surprised by any of those workflows? Do they lose any data? You know, all that kind of stuff. And we all use Rumpus basically all the time while we're doing our testing. So we have tests also. Like our QA team does specific testing of these things. We're kind of implicitly testing all the time, but it's not the same as like the scenario where somebody has a bunch of devices, they don't know how Rumpus works, and they start moving around between devices. Because we know, like,
you know where the edges are.
Yeah, I know what the edges are. I have a habit of like, if I'm going to switch devices, I go back to the main menu because I know the main menu is guaranteed to sync, right? Like I've built up flows over time based on my understanding of expectations.
Yeah, you don't just like on your phone, pop open the like app selector and just fucking nuke the program while it's running before you go switch. So it's like there's stuff like that where you guys go, okay, do we account for these?
Yeah, and we can't account for everything, but we want to at least see what some of the common experiences and expectations are, and if we can accommodate any of the ones that did fall through the cracks.
And it was like you also tend to see like as far as like actual participation. Like we talked about, one of the things we want to be able to test is just like what happens toward the end of the game for people. The most untested stuff is always going to be in the middle and the end. It's kind of just naturally how these work, and so we have to get a big enough pool that you're confident that, like, again, fucking someone's going to make it all the way through in this like total timeline we have. And then on top of that, taking into account that typically what you'll see, if you have like really good participation, even with all the invites you send out, you'll get like around 80% of the people to like play it for a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. Because again, it's like we always talk about any of these numbers that you look at, whether it's like wish lists to purchases or email opens to wish lists to purchases, you're just slicing out chunks.
There's always a funnel.
Always a funnel. And so you have to select enough people. Then not only do you have we have device coverage, but you have enough people with enough devices that even once you chunk out a random third of them, that you still have some coverage, right? So I think it seems like the selection has been well received so far. And we also sent out rejection notes, which I do want to talk about because like drives me crazy. It's not that hard to do. And it's one of those things that, like, whether it's dev teams, jobs, I don't know, letting someone know that they are not being like, not just ghosting people who took a moment to apply for a thing is, I think, just a nice, considerate thing to do.
There's an element of compassion, especially for something like what this is, right? Because this is, for us, people volunteering to their time to do the beta is them doing us a huge solid, because they're throwing a bunch of time at a thing to give us, and then spending some time telling us about their experience so that we can make sure that this game launches really well, right? That's a really cool thing that people are doing and helping us out with. And on their side, like, the reason they do it is because either they just want to help us out because they like the studio, they like our past work, they like the podcast, whatever, or because they love the franchise and they just want all the Crashlands they can get, right? And so, in both those cases, people are pretty excited about the idea of getting to be involved in the process. And so the fact that we had to tell almost everybody, 90% of people, no, sorry, is like, you have to just take a sec to think about, like, that's going to really bum some people out, especially the most excited people, right? Because we're not selecting based on how excited people are. We're selecting based on how much test coverage we think we can get for our specific testing goals, right? And so, people who like seem really passionate about it, like, that definitely biases things in their favor, right? But when you've got 900 applicants, and the only reason they're applying is because they're passionate, that's all. It's like, it's almost all of them, Yeah. So keeping that in mind when you're doing this kind of a thing is really important. And so that's that final matter of, like, you don't want people just left wondering, and then seeing other people be like, "Oh, fuck yeah, I got into the beta," right?
That's the worst.
And so I had a whole like operation of how I rolled it out, where I first set up the private Discord. And then, because I had to figure out, because there's a timing problem, and then I added a a Discord role with a weird name, so people wouldn't know what it was if they did notice it, to all the people who got in. So I did that, and then I revealed that Discord channel to them, and immediately pinged them and said, "Hey, welcome to the beta. Also, please keep your excitement here, because anybody else will be bummed they didn't get in, and it would be, you don't want to make them even more bummed than they already are, right? So that way the people who are most likely to immediately be like, fuck yeah, I've been like, I got them.
Yeah, give them a place to celebrate, right?
They're responding to the ping in the place where it's good to share their excitement.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're not going to do it in the public channels where everybody's bummed.
So I do that, and then I go and I send out the acceptance emails to everybody else, including a line in there basically saying, here's a link to this Discord, which is now available, and you're already in, because as part of the application, I got everybody's Discord handles. So you're already in. Here's a Discord. Again, same reminder. Some people are going to be bummed. So here's the place to go celebrate. So do that. And then finally send out the rejection emails. Because also there's a lot more of them. So there's more risk that because there's 800 of them. So there's more of a risk that they don't all go through. Google starts to get blocked. They start going to spam, whatever. So I wanted to make sure that the acceptance emails could successfully go out before I send the huge number of rejection emails. And so I had this whole sequence that was oriented around making sure that I gave everybody the best opportunity to not feel terrible about what had happened when they didn't get selected.
Yeah, it's never fun to not make it into a thing, even if it's just like a video game beta,
No,
so
it was it's
keep that in mind.
Yeah, and pulling the trigger when I was had my little draft email there, of
oh, those are always terrible.
Sorry, bud. And it's I did it through Gmail's mail merge feature, and so I hit the continue button. That's what happens instead of a send. It's continue, and it's hey, this is going to go to 805 people. Are you sure you want to do that? Whatever. And I'm just looking at it.
Sorry.
I know exactly. It's
a single tear rolls down.
It's just such a bummer.
Yeah, we care a lot. I understand.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things. It's like I've been there. Where I was really excited about something and didn't get it.
Of course. Yeah. Everybody's been there.
And it's easy to say oh, it's just a video game, right? But people love stuff. And
this does make me think though about how certain incentives line up with compassion and empathy, because one of the more interesting experiences I've had, because to me this is all about communication, right, between the players and the developers, right? Yep. The developers being we want what's best for you. We still have to operate with constraints, so we still want to be communicative about when things don't necessarily go in your favor, right?
Expectations are a big, expectation management is a big part of this whole communication.
Yeah, because the thing is, because our game is a game where you buy the game and you have it now, and that's it, right? So we want to make sure that your experience with the game is just the best possible experience that it can be. That's where our that's where our priorities begin and end, right? And so we don't run a live service game.
Yep.
If we run a live service game, then there's a secondary motivation, which is to figure out how to get as much money from you and make you play a lot, right? And you having fun with the game is actually not a metric.
How you say it's required, but not sufficient.
It's not even necessarily
a means to
required.
that end. It's one of the tools we can use. You having fun is a tool we could use to get you to spend money and time in the game, right?
Yeah,
Rather
it's
than
one of the more
purpose itself.
Yeah, and it makes me think about as we're doing this, because of the way that we're structuring the game and the way the incentives are lined up, everything for us is all about the players, right? And them just having the best time. But when I think about there was a time I think it was in 2020 when I was getting back into playing WoW, and the game was just doing so badly, and players were leaving the game in droves. And every time a new patch came out, it was like a bomb got dropped into the game. Every decision that the developers were making was one that the players hated. And they just kept doing it. And players kept posting feedback and stuff, and the developers would just never respond to anything that the players said or did. You had people making YouTube videos who had been 10-year, content creators about WoW. Yeah. And they'd be I just can't, this game, I'm just having such a bad time. I'm done. I'm not going to make videos about this game anymore. And those people knew that that would basically deleting most of their livelihood, but it was just so depressing for them that they just couldn't do it anymore. Right. And to have that happening, and then the developers just doubling down and not responding to any of that, it was because of the incentive structure. Because for the developers, they were looking at the decreasing player numbers and stuff, and they were our subscription revenue is declining.
Yeah.
how do we make changes to the game to make people play it longer, right? And that was their decision criteria. And so they just kept jamming stuff into the game to slow stuff down. And they knew that players were going to hate that, and so they couldn't talk about it, right?
Yeah. If you you can't really, a lot of times you can't really, I guess, not be explicit when you're confronted about something like that, right? Because it's like
your patch note isn't going to say, "Oh, we made everything slower so that you play more." That's not.
It just says increase the amount of tokens for this thing by 25%. That's all that it says, right? And it's like the subtext is so it takes you longer to do, and therefore,
Well, there's that nuance that's interesting, right? Because we talked about this a lot in the past too, where a lot of what's fun in a game is generated by where the friction remains.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so we do that where we'll slow something down. We'll make something a little more difficult. We'll throw some sand in the gears of something, right? Because we think that on balance, doing it to that thing nets you a more fun, positive, enjoyable overall experience, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where that nuance comes from. Is like,
well, you're not slowing it down to slow it down, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not slowing it down for a KPI that's unrelated to are you having a good time.
You're slowing it down to create space for other enjoyable game experiences, and not just so it takes longer, right? Yep. And so the problem is like if as a developer your incentives are lined up such that you are routinely pushed to make decisions that are essentially hostile towards your player base, then you can't communicate anymore. Because as soon as you pop your head up, people just start pelting you with eggs.
Yeah, well, I think it's also the case that the internet being the internet, that even if you're just like, I don't know, standard dev doing standard dev stuff, like making a game but not patch notes, it's very easy to still get like really toxic people responding to those things in really like very over the top ways. We've got some of those notes in the past. So it's like, it's not even just if you're doing bad stuff, then people are mad at you. It's like people are just kind of on the internet can be kind of unhinged about any given patch note. And so
it was Gary from Gary's Mod, right? He said just like players want to win at the game more, right? So if you release a patch that like makes some aspect of the game harder or like makes someone's favorite item a little bit weaker, right?
Yep.
People respond disfavorably.
Yes.
But it's also a question of how often that kind of thing happens and whether the player base at large understands the intent and agrees with the direction.
Well, I think that's where community management comes into me, which is like having a player base where I think starting with like the alpha or the beta for us, or even how we manage the Discord, where it's pretty clear from the jump for anybody who's involved at this point that we are trying to do our best by them, right? So there's an ability then for that overall vibe from the community, that like smaller group of people, to kind of permeate once the game launches, because those are oftentimes like your kind of root members, right, in a community.
Yeah.
To permeate
pillars.
Yeah, where someone might come in a little hot, into the Discord being like, why the devs do this? And people are
these
like,
idiot devs,
shit your beans. Like,
cool it down.
Yeah, and you can't. It's hard to say that as a dev. I can't pop in and be like, calm down, because people are like, don't tell me to be calm. That's fine. But like, if your friends are like, yo, you chill, like,
but we do pop in as devs, and because we've had a lot of practice over the years, just kind of diffusing, and the key to it is basically just saying, it's that whole like, hey, I hear what you're saying. I know this kind of sucks sometimes for some people, right? Here's why we did it. And like 9 times out of 10, that's officially diffused the situation, right? And the other 10% of times, inevitably you got to kick that person out of the community, because if that wasn't enough, they are coming in to be a problem,
Yeah.
So I think that's where that nuance here is, right? Because like Seth, what you were describing of like the whole WoW community is kind of up in arms, that kind of stuff, and you have all these people who are posting like, what if you only would do this, then it would be fine. And like, that's not necessarily true, right? That's not actually, because it's not that any given piece of feedback, even if there's a lot of it, is, and you can see this with like something like Helldivers, which has a pretty positive-ish community compared to most other games, especially online games. And for the first, 3 or 6 months of the game coming out, there was almost universal excitement about the changes that were happening, because the game was so new. People weren't really entrenched fully into their gameplay styles, like that kind of stuff. As the game wore on, the player community had more and more hostility towards the changes that were coming out.
Yeah.
It's also because the dev team was doing more nerfing than buffing, which like typically, like in any given, especially in an online context, like an online game context, nerfing strategies that are currently favored in order to balance better with things that aren't currently working well doesn't make people feel particularly good. Does that make sense? Because it's like I had a strategy that was working. Why can't you make those weapons work instead of making my weapon?
Yeah, make the things that suck less instead of making the things that don't suck more.
So then to the nuance, it's like
which is they weren't wrong necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
But that's where it's really hard to tell though, because especially as a community gets more and more entrenched in a particular way of playing and their expectations about what the game is, right?
Yeah.
Then any deviation from that, when you get a negative response from the community, you have to like really figure it. Because also the Helldivers team, the dev team, with pressure from the business team who are trying to also make them do things right. Over time, because Helldivers was just fucking taking off like a rocket, right? It's not sustainable. It just isn't.
Yeah,
at some point, the numbers started to drop, and then once they started to drop, they kind of really start to drop, right? And it still is like to this moment in time. I would bet anything if I were to go look at Steam right now, there's like 20,000 people playing the game. Right?
Oh, it's doing great.
It's doing great by any reasonable human being's metrics, right? The problem is that if you are, owned by a company that wants growth at all costs and everything has to be bigger all the time, then everybody starts to panic when the numbers start to drop. And they're like, how do we make sure people keep playing? And so with a lot of the stuff that the Helldivers team were doing, like it's kind of hard to tell from the outside if like the changes they were making were because they thought that would make the current gameplay experience better, or if they thought, oh no, we're starting to lose people, we need to do something that will make them stick around, right? Because those aren't the same.
Yeah, not always
goal. And also, but you as a developer and a designer, you also don't necessarily realize that you've entangled those two things either, right? So like nothing about any of this even has to be nefarious, when it comes to
I think it's, that's usually the case actually. 99% of the time.
It just can be,
Well, but particularly with even if it's not a live service game, if it's a multiplayer game, period, right? If it's based on multiplayer, then you have that additional incentive of like, I need people to be in the game as much as possible so that when other people start playing, there's people there, right?
Because people are the content, and if there aren't enough of them, then the game does just die, right? So
and so there is this kind of weird kind of push pull with regard to time and how time is a mechanic in games, right? Of like, how long does something take? How long do matches last? How long do you sit in a queue to get into a game? Or like if there's currencies that you get over time to like unlock cosmetics or something, how much grinding does it take, right? It's like by playing with those time metrics, then you can like try to get people to stick around in the game longer to like get the stuff that they want, and then that creates more players for other people to play with, right? And so but like players don't like spending time to get stuff. And so there's always this like, it will always, that especially like that design lever will always feel adversarial.
Well, I think what's funny though is that like the reality is you're always, when you're playing a game, you're exchanging your time for something, whether it's like in the very broad sense, like I'm doing enjoying some entertainment right now, or it's, harvesting some stuff, like build this armor. So I think what's funny about it is that like, again, it's more like there's a line somewhere in there where you go from it being part of the experience of like, being a fucking person, which is things take time to do, and it's enjoyable to spend your time to
where you notice that it's taking
where you see
a while.
And so I think that's always the stuff to watch out for. And
because so much of the purpose of time in a gameplay experience is to create anticipation. It's like, it's cool because if you don't have that, if there's no anticipation, you just have all of the this, right?
Well, now you just got to click, right?
And this is where what I'm most interested in for the beta is how the insights feel for people, because this is kind of weird. Because like in Crashlands 2,
so the insights you get are locked to the research tracks, basically.
Yeah, like you get these buddies and they research stuff for you, and that doesn't require you to do anything other than just like choose which thing you want them to research next, and then that takes some amount of time. And when it's done, you come back and you sort of like retrieve the recipe or whatever it was that they researched. And then you choose the next thing, right? So it's kind of like you play like StarCraft, and you get like a building that lets you like research the next thing in the tech tree, and it just takes time, right? And what's kind of interesting about it is, so I was doing a playthrough like a week ago, and I got into Act 2 and started researching stuff and, progressing into Act 2. And within like the first hour, my feedback that I came back to Sam with was, I'm overwhelmed. Like I'm unlocking things way too fast. I'm getting recipes way faster than I can get the materials to craft them. And I feel like I'm just getting buried under all of this like stuff that I want to do, but my list of to-dos just keeps getting longer and I can't get on top of it, you know? And so we slowed that down, right?
Well, I think we added some gates, actually, is what we did.
We added some gates to some stuff.
You can't just keep going down that research track indefinitely, chaining.
Yeah, but we did both. Yeah. We slowed it down in a couple of different ways, and then we like spread things out more and gated more things. Because even though like waiting isn't a game mechanic, right? In the sense that like you just sit there and you don't do anything, but what it does is it kind of like it creates a temporal gap so that you start the research, and then if it takes 7, 10, whatever minutes for that research to finish, you've got quests, you've got crafting, you've got exploration, you got tons of other stuff that you're doing. And so you kind of go in a loop, right? Like you go out in the world, you do your stuff, and then once you got a bunch of materials and whatnot, you come back to your base, check in on your research, and start the next thing. Yep. Well, if that research takes 3 minutes, for example, then it makes exploration feel bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're like, as soon as you leave your base, you're like, yeah, but it's probably almost done. So I'll just like go like chop down 2 trees and then go back, right? And so it actually needs to take a while, but it can't take too long because then that just slows down the whole game in a bad way.
It needs to work with the loop, right? And I think it's one of those interesting things where because we went through a couple different iterations of that particular system, but once we actually had it using time, that was around like the 7 to 10 minute mark is where you saw it really working because what it was. The whole idea of it was that, okay, you set a marker in the future for a player to look forward to that they're choosing. And then with enough time that they go do other stuff. And when they basically make it so that every time you return to your base to do some crafting that you already were planning on doing, right? Like your thing you went out to go harvest for or a quest you went out to go do, that you just immediately get a little reward essentially. Yeah, from getting home, right?
Yeah.
And it's
but the weird thing is
balance is tricky on that, right?
Yeah, because the weird thing is if we're playing through it and like if we get a sense from our beta testers that like, oh yeah, like I felt like I got overwhelmed at this point in the game, like things were taken, like I had so many recipes and I was getting scattered all over the place, blah blah blah. Then like our response to that might be, oh, we might need to actually increase the amount of time that this research takes a little bit, right? And if our patch notes, if it says like, yeah, insights just take longer now, right, then generally a player's going to be like, what? No, right? Even though it will probably be a much, much better experience. For
like the framing and the communication, all this stuff is super important, right? And oftentimes this is why you see patches that are not just the notes in the literal sense, like insight speed reduced by 15%, where the fuck, but like it's the frame of the thing, which is,
Yeah, they'll be more vague. They'll be like balanced the exploration loop by adjusting some of the timers. It's like the kind of thing you would see, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's pretty tough. But yeah, I'm interested to see kind of what levers we end up pulling during the beta. Also, we've been kind of prepping for beta and launch in other ways. Like we're starting to get a little bit out there on the interview circuit. So I don't know if you guys want to talk a bit about how that's gone so far.
It's been fun.
Done a couple.
Adam hooked me up with a Game Rant interview a couple days ago. So I think there should be some articles about that sometime soon. But it was just really a fun time. A lot of it was talking about, what the idea of a sequel is, which is interesting. I feel like it's a more fun question to answer than like the much more broad one when it's not a sequel game. Cause like no one knows, I guess before anyone's played any game that you've made, it's so hard to understand with words what the heck the experience of playing it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the elevator pitch concept always pissed me off so much because you could spend like 4 years making this giant thing, that has just a million things going on in it. And then somebody would be like, pitch it to me in 30 seconds.
Yeah, and it makes sense, but it's just super lossy, right? And so it's really nice actually talking about.
Yeah, an elevator pitch, I think that framing, it's the lossiest format to describe a video game in the fucking universe.
Because you have to boil it down to stuff that is like other stuff so that person has a frame of reference. And then it just ends up sounding bland, right?
Yep.
It's like
it's kind of experienced as an audio visual medium, so like you gotta
Yeah. It's tricky. So it was really fun just talking. I mean, that was kind of the highlight of it. Just kind of talking about it in the context of, original Crashlands it was interesting. And I think it felt like the person who understood what I was saying because they've already played a Crashlands game. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to being like, oh yeah, it's going to work like this, So
one thing I really like, Sam, when you were kind of sharing what you had talked about in the interview with us afterwards, something that stuck out to me was when you're talking about their memory of the original game and kind of how it looked and how it played compared to Crashlands 2 and what the reality was.
Yeah. So, because one of the questions was like, how do you decide on stuff like art direction or whatever else for a sequel? And a big part of what we talked about early on was, we knew that Crashlands was important to a lot of people, and that the kind of, it's like the rose tinted glasses, but like the memory of playing a game is, I would say, almost more like the high level experience of playing it, not the bits and bobs. It's not like, I don't know, like chopping a particular fucking log tree 1,000 times, right? It's like what that whole thing distills down to in a very like game DNA sense.
I think for me, it's like a Diablo 2, like I played the fuck out of as a kid, right? And then when my wife and I had a year apart from each other, living in different places, before we got married, then that was like, we needed something to do to like spend time together. And so we ended up just settling on Diablo 2 because she'd also played it a fuckload as a kid. And but that was now like 15 years later or something, like, or I even know a long time later, right? Since the last time I played. And that was one of those really jarring things where like I booted it up and I was like, this is not like, it's exactly
like shit.
Yeah. Like the audio was exactly, I was like, holy shit, I'm back, right?
Oh yeah.
But the visuals, I was like, oh, this is not at all what this game was like to play. Like, is this really what I was looking at?
I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours looking at this.
And I think a big part of it is like basically the memory of it is sort of like the memory of, I would say, the actual mechanical bits and bobs is infused with the actual like emotional experience of playing the thing. And so essentially, if you had a good time, it's like going back and playing Pokemon Blue or Red. If you played one of those as a kid, if you had a good time with it, you remember it. The remembered experience is a much more elevated thing than an actual
high fidelity, basically.
It's like the most beautiful, like possible version of it. And so what's funny, I mentioned this to reviewers, like, our big goal with it was to essentially say, how can we make it so that playing Crashlands 2 feels like the memory of playing Crashlands to someone who played it 10 years ago, 9 years ago as a kid? Can you make it so that when they sit down to play Crashlands 2, they're like, oh yeah, like I'm like, this is great. This is exactly what it was. And then they look at the first one and they're like, wait, the fuck? Like, what? And it was very funny because he mentioned that he popped up the Steam page for it and was looking at Crashlands 2 and then went and looked at Crashlands immediately afterwards and had kind of that jarring thing where he was like, Crashlands 2 looks so good. Yeah. Crashlands 2 looks so good. And then I was like, oh, this looks like Crashlands. Yeah. And then I popped over to original one and I was like, what? I was like, yeah, okay, good. So we nailed it, I think, on that, at least on that front, And so the question is like, can the experience of it, hold up to that and do that for people? That's also part of what the beta test is for, right? All those expectations people have.
Well, that was one of the fun things when I was reading through because one of the questions I had in the application was just, what are you hoping or expecting to get out of the playtest experience, right? And for all the people who got selected, I read all of them. I also read many of the others, but there were 900, so I didn't read all of them, But they were just so delightful and fun, but along the same dimension where there was one person who was like, oh, I want to play this so that I can like talk to my uncle about it. Because when I was a kid, I watched him play the original Crashlands.
Oh,
right?
Nice.
And then there's a mom who's like, I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I have my own kids, but I played the shit out of original Crashlands years ago, and I want to give them the Crashlands experience, So like it has like the both directions thing going, which is it was just so delightful to read through that.
So again, when you as a player, like if that, like the kid or the person with the uncle who played it like with them, when you're remembering playing Crashlands, you're not just remembering playing Crashlands. You see what I'm saying? Where it's like, it's infused with like the warmth of that whole time. And so that's kind of like, how do you take that emotional, like experiential infusing of a memory of the mechanics of a game and then like fucking convert it into reality for a sequel in a way so that people what they remember being so lovely about the first one is somehow better represented in the sequel, right?
Yeah,
visually.
I mean, it was fascinating. Like when the demo came out, when the alpha came out, that people would describe to us ways in which they would describe mechanics from the original game and say that they wanted that mechanic in Crashlands 2. And that mechanic was not in the original game.
I know
that was just how they remembered it. Yeah.
They just remembered it being that way. It's like, it used to be that when I did this, then this would happen. And I really want to see that happen again. It's like, that was never
one of my favorite ones was people being like, oh, I want to be able to move while I'm, using a weapon or like swinging.
Yeah.
Casting.
Yeah. Like in the original.
Like in the original. And it's like, you couldn't in the original.
That was not there. You could never do that.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, okay. So there's something we're not capturing though, right? There's something we can better capture then, but it's not mechanically in the way that people think it is.
Because I mean, because the core thing about combat in Crashlands and in Crashlands 2 is the telegraphs, right? And given that you cannot fight and move at the same time, that's what makes them threatening. Yep. Like you have to weave in there, get your hit in, and then get out, right?
Yeah, it's the core design pillar of the combat system in original and Crashlands 2.
Yeah. And the reason that people would remember moving and fighting at the same time is because it was a one-touch interaction. So you would tap an enemy, and Flux would then run to the enemy, stop moving, and start attacking. Yeah. But it was one input, and you would move and attack, right? So in people's memories,
and then attack.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Move and then attack. Yeah. But in people's minds, the then goes away, right? And it's like I just tapped, and Flux just ran around like crazy and was just smashing shit, right? It's like, no. Flux just ran up, stopped, started swinging. If you started running again, the swinging stopped. So it was never an option. Yep. But we've done some stuff to kind of like reimagine, because in Crashlands 2, because we do have to listen to that, because it does feel like
it feels more planted than the original one did, even though mechanically again it's not. But like,
because the reason is that you're the one deciding to stop moving, right? Like because now you control Flux. It's not just a one touch. And so you run up to the target, then you stop running and start attacking, which means you're recognizing now that you cannot move and attack at the same time. Whereas in the first game, you never had to think about that. And so we made just a bunch of changes
after the alpha, like because of that, right? Everything from a lot of the earlier
we kept that mechanic. Oh yeah, we've made it feel a lot better that's how it works.
I think it feels pretty good now, but it's funny because it's that kind of things, which I think it's a really tall order on the dev side to be like, hey, I got this like really beautiful memory of playing this game with my uncle. Can the sequel give that? To
capture that?
And it's like, oh yes, I'm just gonna say, yeah, it's going to. It's definitely going to. But like, in order to do that, we gotta do some fucking voodoo on our side to make that. You know what I mean? Like to bring that forward. And I think that's why people are talking about the art or whatever else. And it's like, I don't know. I mentioned a lot of the art journey side of things being suffused with enough rage coming out of Level Head that I shouldn't want to be ignored. But a lot of it too is just recognizing like you're making a sequel to a thing that is very special to people. And so it somehow has to look more special than it did in order to live up to the memory.
It has to look as special as the original felt.
Exactly.
In your mind from
your wonderful
vaguely recalling playing it 9 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
It
was really fun.
I had an interview with Gaming on Phone, which is I'm impressed because they launched in 2020, I think, or 2019. Nice. And so I was talking to their editor, and I was like, as far as I can see, almost every other mobile game site is gone, right? But that was already happening.
Isn't Touch Arcade gone?
Touch Arcade's gone, yeah. They're still doing their Patreon and podcast, and they have like certain things that they're doing, but the site is basically kind of like frozen in time. And Touch Arcade was the big one. That was the big one that was kind of left. It was like, is that in Pocket Gamer? There's still a few that are around, right? But I hadn't heard of anybody launching a new, and frankly, any game site at this point. The only other one I know of right now is Aftermath, but that's all like ex-Kotaku people.
Yeah, you launched it using the audience from a previous thing.
Yeah, exactly. They took their audience with them. So this is like a brand new gaming site, and not brand new. Again, 2020. It's 5 years old now or whatever. But I was like, I'm honestly very impressed that you managed to do this, to make a gaming focused, mobile focused website. We had a similar conversation about these things. But one of the questions that he was really interested in was like given all that it took to get here to make Crashlands 2, is the next thing Crashlands 3? You know, like, is that what's... And my first thing was just like flat out just, well, no, the next thing, whatever it is not Crashlands 3, because we need a fucking break. But that was the first time I also kind of thought about, because we've been talking about this on the podcast internally about like just how we definitely don't want to do that. But the gap between, not just in time, but the gap in everything between Crashlands 1 and Crashlands 2, it's a 9-year gap. And then the gap in quality, like this is the whole idea that we're talking about of like, you could look back and Crashlands 2 feels like what it felt like to play Crashlands 1, right? Mm-hmm. What the fuck would that mean for Crashlands 3 compared to Crashlands 2, right? I can't even fathom what that means
until it's been a few years, actually. You know what I mean?
But like even then, like, because like even when we made Crashlands 1, it was the best thing we could make at the time, and it's also really good. But at the time, we were able to see the whole time. We were like, we can see a million ways this could in theory be better. Not that we could do necessarily.
Right. Not that we can get there, but
but we could see it. And then Crashlands 2 is that. Crashlands 2 is all of those things.
Yeah, we took the time to figure out how to do all the things. I mean, like to me, like the one thing that we didn't get was like mounts.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like some features that aren't there.
But that was also like it would be cool if, but once you start to think about what it would mean to do it, it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't really. You know? But I was thinking about that with like, I don't think in the same way that like Diablo, say 2 to 3, like feels like this just enormous fidelity change, right? But Diablo 3 to 4, it's basically
they had to kind of change art direction in order for it to be interesting again, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do the same thing. They had to go more gothic, otherwise, like
which meant that they were capturing like the gameplay and vibe, right? Mm-hmm. But they weren't. It wasn't the same as like feeling like, oh, I'm just like playing playing Diablo 2, but it's just like what I remember it actually being, right? It's truly a different thing.
Yep.
And I feel like because with Crashlands 2, I don't see a way, given the quality of Crashlands 2, to make it better along any of its dimensions. To make it better, I can only see ways to make it different, right?
You could like tell a different story or whatever.
Yeah, we could tell a different story that's otherwise it's kind of the same.
That's
context.
interesting. Yeah, I think what was interesting talking to the editor from Game Rant was that, you know, I think when you start distilling things down, when you try to distill things down on design level into those DNA pieces, I think for me, it's been this realization how a lot of things that seem like they are required from a mechanical standpoint. So that's like controls, right? We talk a lot about like switching from one touch to not one touch, right? In the case of Crashlands 2, a lot of things that you think might be required in order to achieve the experience, oftentimes are not, like they're not actually, they're too specific to be really the thing that's causing that to resonate. So like the one touch controls is not, in my mind, required, right? For like a Crashlands game. It took a while for us. I mean, remember, like early dev took a while for us to like get there to be like, yeah, I think this is fine, that we're not going to do that.
It's cool. And it's a nice way to control the game, but for mobile.
Exactly. So it's like, is that the constraint that we want to keep on it? And is that like, again, owning up to some bigger, higher level experience here? And so I think talking to him about it, I was like, you know, I think if you really get into those, if you figure out what those DNA pieces are, it's almost like holding a prism up to a beam of light. And it's like, I can see how you can split the thing apart and then sort of like you said, take it in slightly different directions for something down the line in a way that still feels like the same game, but is definitely not in the same way to me that Crashlands 2 is, where it's like you could go into some like choice architecture, you know, like Baldur's Gate 3 or Fallout style, where it's like you actually are engaging with the dialogue a little bit and like, you know, deciding what happens and there's bigger consequences. You could go into like a multiplayer context in some ways, right?
Yeah, kind of don't starve together style, where you kind of pull some of the elements out, but then add in, like,
yeah,
you
or
pull
some,
you kind of
like
change how
mishmash.
story and stuff works, so that you can have less of it in a lighter, more adaptable way, so that we can then have multiple.
Exactly. But like I think you can get there by taking, again, you have to like take liberty, right? With like
that's what I mean. It's like, we can create different kinds of franchise experiences, right? But this, I think this is something we have to like kind of celebrate while we're doing with Crashlands 2. This whole like, this we only get to do once, of having this like extremely nostalgic thing for people, and ourselves included, right? That we, because of spacing and time, and then because of the sheer degree of an upgrade that it is, that we create that particular experience of like oh, this is exactly what I wanted as a person who loved this original thing. And it's honestly what I remember that first experience being. And it's the perfect nostalgia punch, right? Just like nails it. I think we only get to do that once.
Yeah.
The other kinds of Crashlands games we make in the future will do other stuff, and they'll be really cool and interesting in their own ways, right? But they won't do this. I think this is the only time we get to do it. And so like something that
you could
I just
do, for
hadn't
example,
thought
like,
about that fact until we had this conversation with I had talked with the editor, and I was like, oh shit, like this is
I see what you're saying.
I agree. I think, to me, at least at the moment, Crashlands 2 is what I want Crashlands to be.
Yeah.
If we were to make another Crashlands game, I don't know if it would be referred to as Crashlands 3, but like you're saying, I've enjoyed Baldur's Gate so much that I am very interested in the idea of making some kind of a turn-based party RPG, right? But that's not Crashlands.
Or is it?
Like,
And that's what I'm getting at.
Crashlands,
How do
'cause, like,
you twist?
Well, but I mean, it could be like in the Crashlands universe, but like to me, like the action combat and the telegraph system and stuff is like such a core part.
You're saying there's a spin-off game and then there's a sequel and they're different things. Yeah.
Or even like, having a crafting system is cool, but so much of the crafting system in the Crashlands games is the harvesting part.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And I don't want to harvest in a turn-based game like that, right? And so like you could still have crafting in a turn-based game, just like how in Baldur's Gate they have the potions and elixirs.
I think here's what I would say.
Because it's how much as Crashlands is like the characters and the setting and the context, and how much of it is the particular way you experience it as a game. Like I think
it comes down to genre. Because this is what I would say. Is like I think if you stay in the same genre, then you can make the sequel. Yeah, I think if you jump genres, you're basically making some kind of a spin-off property or whatever else is based on it. But I think in my mind, then from a genre standpoint, it comes down to like a bifurcation in direction, right? It's like a lot of what we've done with Crashlands 2 is actually lean harder into the RPG side of the game, much harder into it. The original game procedure generated. This one handcrafted everything. There's like juice infusions, almost like a bit of a leveling up thing happening.
But it's tied to like exploration more.
Exactly. So it's like it's pushed more into like an open world RPG with like which has a crafting and harvesting loop as like the driver, but it's much more on that side of things. And so in my mind, it's just a question of like, given how the open world RPG genre looks mechanically, where can you go? And for me, like I got at least like a dozen different directions
there are tons
to hop
of
into.
Yeah.
And that I think that could, could maybe in like 5-10 years time sort of manage to do the same thing. But a lot of them, because they're, again, it's like it's doing what you've already done and more, right? So a number of them would require like jumping to fucking 3D or like whatever else, and so it's like these are, I feel like for the 2D side of things, I feel like it's either peak or it's like peak adjacent in terms of like how far we can push it on the open world RPG side. I think if you could do like some choice architecture or something like that. For the next one.
Everything else would be marginally different, like a little bit better special effects maybe or something. Yeah, like, better shaders, higher res.
Yeah, I think it really would be because one of the things I'm interested in, or like that not necessarily interested in doing, but I know is a thing I feel like would be in line with it, is somehow being able to bring some of that slapstick that we always like about, or like the kind of goofiness of the game more into the mechanical experience of it. And a lot of that to me is through physics, ragdolls, that sort of shit, which feels like it would fit perfectly, but all of that requires 3D. And like, that's a whole.
It's funny because there are 2D physics engines, but they are two-dimensional. And Crashlands is weird because since it's a top-down 2D game, it's fake 3D, right?
Yep. Like we've run into so many problems because it's fake 3D. You know what I mean? Like it's hard.
It looks 3D, but it's all just pictures. Yeah. Right.
so it's like, to me, that's a lot of the next things that would feel like, again, they would enhance that basic DNA of what we're talking about would have to occur in the context of another dimension being added. Yeah. And I think that's the tricky part.
I think the interesting thing is that for us to do that, we would need Crashlands 2 to be extremely successful, so we have enough runway to do it. And we have to retool fully again. But not in the same way, because the Crashlands 1 and Crashlands 2 retooling was there's a lot of like learning how to do new things and that kind of stuff, certainly, right? But still at the core, it was like the same kind of thing as architecturally as a 2D game, right? Mm-hmm. Moving to 3D. And like every game we've ever made, every jam game, everything, right?
Oh yeah.
It's a bit of 2D game. The 3D jump is going to change design like fundamentally, like how to think about design principles of games, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the fucked up thing is to do 3D. Like Sam and I did it. We've done 3D before. And we did a 3D game in a jam a couple years ago. Like we can make a 3D game, but to translate everything that we've learned and all the skills and tools and capabilities we have in 2D over to 3D, it's going to take years. Oh, yeah. Years and years. So
it's going to require making other games. And I think that's the idea. That's kind of what I expressed too in the interview. I was like,
there will be a gap, I guess.
No matter what happens, we're going to have to make some different games first. And that's either because we just need a fucking break. We just need some smaller scoped things that we can kick out.
Quadrupus Rampage 2, maybe.
That's still what I'm pitching.
Little roguelike.
So something along those lines, right? Something that we can be like, oh yeah, we can get this out. We can get some extra revenue, hopefully, coming in, sharpen some skills, try something different, right? Do all that kind of stuff as we try to figure out what is the next big thing, which is probably a Crashlands thing, right? What is that? And how do we get there? But if it's the case that we think it's 3D, then that means these next games are going to have to be 3D, so we can figure out how the fuck.
And they'll have to be quite a bit smaller.
It has to be a lot very small. As small as we can get them.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, I think you can push things very far, and I think again, like in a 2D setting, we could continue pushing and like get into like the world more on the world simulation stuff, or like colony management, or again, you can go more in depth mechanically or systemically. I think it's always a question of which part of the DNA of the game are you really trying to like push to that next level, and then does that bring a new audience in? A new market, or is it just kind of more of the same market? And I think that's always where the rub is, right? For something like this.
Yep. Yeah. I don't know, man. Yeah, it's gonna be everything is contingent on what happens with Crashlands 2. Yep. We have no idea. So it goes well, but yeah. So that's all the time we have for this week. I would like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. Get over to the App Store and pre-order, and get over to Google Play and pre-register. Do all that stuff with all your phones and all your gadgets, and it'll help the game have a successful launch, and we'd appreciate it. So thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye.